The barn was on fire, and every man in Drywater Creek stood back and watched it burn. Every man except the woman they'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Clara Briggs ran straight into the smoke, wide-hipped, heavy-footed, the woman nobody hired, nobody vouched for, nobody wanted. She came out dragging a calf twice her weight. Then she went back in. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The notice was handwritten, not printed, not official, just a man's hand pressed hard into the paper. The letters large and uneven, the way writing gets when the person doing it isn't used to asking for help and is doing it anyway because there's no other option left. Clara Briggs read it 3 times, standing in front of the community board outside Rafferty's General Store in Drywater Creek. And each time she read it, she felt something different. First, disbelief. Second, calculation. Third, the particular brand of desperate hope that she had learned to treat like a lit match near dry grass. Useful if handled carefully, catastrophic if she let it run. If. Ridgeline Ranch. High country north of Settlers Pass seeks a woman of capable hands and unbreakable constitution. Duties include all domestic labor preservation and smoke work and livestock assistance as required. Wages monthly. Room and board provided. No letters of reference necessary. Inquire in person. Ask for Rowan Callister. No letters of reference necessary. She pulled the notice off the board and folded it into her coat pocket and walked away before anyone could see what was on her face. The women near the flour sacks didn't see her go. They were busy talking the way they were always busy talking, in the bright, particular way of women who talk loudest about people who aren't in the room to answer. Clara Briggs was asking at the mill again, said one. And said the other. And they told her the same as everyone else told her. No position. A pause filled with significance. Can't blame them. A woman with no family, no references, no standing, said the first woman, finishing the sentence. The way you finish a thing you've said so many times it no longer requires thought. Clara was already out the door. She had 32 years behind her, and a history she couldn't make pretty, no matter how she arranged it. Her husband had died 4 years back, not heroically, not peacefully, just suddenly and without warning. The way some men go, leaving her with nothing but a farmhouse that wasn't paid for, and a reputation that attached itself to widows in small towns like a second skin. She'd lost the house inside a year. She'd been moving since laundry work and Harding kitchen labor outside of Pike's Crossing, a brief, miserable season of domestic service in a household where the man of the house had ideas about what that meant. She had walked away from that last one with nothing but her bag and a bruise on her arm she didn't tell anyone about. 3 towns, 2 years. No references that meant anything. No family left to speak for her. No pastor willing to put his name to hers. And now this notice. Rowan Callister, Ridgeline Ranch. High country. She didn't know the name. But she knew what no letters of reference necessary meant to a woman in her position. It meant someone was desperate enough to take a chance. She intended to be worth it. Doss ran the only supply wagon that made regular runs up toward Settlers Pass, and he took passengers when he had room and the mood suited him. Clara found him loading at the east end of town before first light the next morning and asked if he was heading north. He looked at her the way people in Drywater Creek had been looking at her for months, the brief assessing glance that moved from her face to her bag to some internal ledger of worthiness and came back uncertain. Ridgeline Ranch, she said before he could decide. I'm answering a notice. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like recalibration. Rowan Callister's place, he said. That's what the notice said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he jerked his chin toward the bench. Climb up, he said. But I ain't responsible for what you're walking into. She climbed up. They were 2 miles out of town before he said another word. You know who Rowan Callister is? He asked. I know he needs help, and he ain't asking for references, she said. That's enough to start with. Doss made a sound low in his throat. Man's been running that ranch alone for going on 2 years. Lost his foreman in the spring. Lost 2 hands to the lumber operation up north before that. He kept his eyes on the trail. Before that, he lost his wife. Clara was quiet. How? She said after a moment. Fever. 3rd winter after they married. Doss shifted the reins. He hasn't been what you'd call easy to work with since. Some folks say he wasn't easy before, but... He paused. There's a difference between a hard man and a damaged one. Roan Callister is the second kind. Is he dangerous? She asked. No? Doss said it without hesitation, which meant something. No, he ain't that. He's just... He searched the air for the right word. Closed off, like a house where all the shutters got nailed down from the inside and nobody's been let in since. Clara looked at the trail ahead. I'm not looking to be let in, she said. I'm looking for wages and a roof. Doss glanced at her sideways, held the look for a second. Right, he said in a tone that didn't entirely agree. And then he was quiet for the rest of the ride, and Clara sat beside him and held her bag on her lap, and breathed the high country air that was cleaner and colder than anything she'd had in months. And she let herself want this, just the job, just the wages, and she kept the wanting small and careful, and tucked away the way you keep a candle in a wind. She heard the ranch before she saw it. Not the sounds of a working place. Not voices. Not the ring of a hammer. Not the particular hum of a household in motion. She heard one thing, a man's voice, low and controlled, talking to an animal that wasn't listening. When the wagon crested the last rise and Ridgeline Ranch came into view below, she saw the source of the voice. A man stood in the open corral with a horse that was rolling its eyes and throwing its weight in the way of an animal that had decided it was done cooperating. The man wasn't pulling on the rope. He wasn't raising his voice or his hand. He was standing still, talking the way you talk to something that's afraid, steady and low, and without demanding anything back. Doss pulled the wagon to a stop near the main house and called out, "Brought your dry goods, Roan, and a woman answering your notice." The man in the corral looked up. He handed the rope to someone she hadn't noticed. A weathered older man near the fence, and he walked toward the wagon, and Clara climbed down before he got there because she'd made it a rule never to wait to be handed something she could reach herself. She landed solidly, settled her skirt, and looked up. Roan Callister was tall in the way of men who work high country. Not bulked out, but constructed like the land itself, had spent years stripping away everything soft and leaving only what could withstand altitude and cold and grief. He had dark hair, grown a little long, jaw unshaved, and eyes the color of the ridge pine in winter, deep green, shading into something that had seen enough weather to stop being surprised by it. He looked at her, not the way men usually looked at her, the glance that slid off, or the glance that stayed too long and meant the wrong thing. He looked at her the way she'd watched him look at that horse, taking in what was there, deciding what it would take. "You answered the notice," he said. "I did." "Clara Briggs." She blinked. "How?" Doss wired ahead. He said it without apology. "I asked for a name." She absorbed that. He'd asked for her name, and she was still standing in front of him, which meant something. She just didn't know yet what. "You've done preservation work," he said. It wasn't entirely a question. "Salt beef lard, rendering dried fruit smoke work if you have the setup. I've worked kitchens, and I've worked farms, and I know the difference between working for someone and working for a place." She met his eyes. "I work for the place." Something moved behind his expression. Nothing as readable as approval. More like attention sharpening. "Livestock," he said. "My family ran cattle until I was 19. I know what a sick animal looks like, and I know what to do before the vet gets there." She paused. "I also know fencing, water management, and how to read land for trouble before it shows up, in case that matters." He was quiet for a moment, that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, but she held her ground in it, and didn't fill it. "It might," he said. Then he looked past her at Doss. She'll take the room. He turned and walked back toward the corral without another word. Doss lowered her bag down to her. He was almost smiling. Told you he don't talk much, he said. I don't need him to talk, Clara said. I need him to pay me. Doss almost smiled the rest of the way. The kitchen was a problem. Not a disaster. She'd walked into disasters before, and this wasn't that. It was more like a place that had given up quietly without drama, the way places do when nobody's paying attention. Cold stove. Flour on the counter from the last time someone used it, which by the look of it had been weeks ago. A side of cured pork hanging without cover. Pots that had been washed once and stacked without drying and had developed opinions about it. She stood in the doorway for 10 seconds, exactly which was as long as she allowed herself to assess before she started working. She had the fire going, the pork dealt with, and a pot of beans started before the first hour was out. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was doing the next thing, and then the thing after that, because that was the only way she knew how to move through the world. She was halfway through a batch of cornbread when the back door opened. The weathered man from the corral, the one Roan had handed the rope to, came in and stopped when he saw her. He took in the lit stove, the clean counter, the pot on the fire, the way a man takes in something that tells him more than the sum of its parts. You must be the new one, he said. Clara Briggs. Gus Hart. He didn't offer his hand, but the way he said his name was the handshake direct plain, expecting the same back. What's in the pot? Beans. Salt pork once they're soft. Cornbread shortly. She glanced at him. When does the crew eat? Noon and sundown, though calling it a crew's generous. He walked to the far window and looked out. 2 boys and me. Roan when he remembers there's food. Does he forget often? He forgets everything that ain't the ranch. Gus was quiet for a moment. Lost near half the summer hay to a fire last month. Still doesn't know what started it. She kept working the dough. How bad is the rest of it? She said. He turned from the window. He had the kind of face that didn't perform emotions, it just recorded them, carved in over years. Bad enough that he put up a notice with no references required, he said. Which for a man like Roan Callister is about as close to desperation as you're going to see him admit to. She shaped the bread. The fire, she said. You said he doesn't know what started it. Gus was quiet for just a fraction too long. That's what he said? Gus answered. It was not the same thing as agreeing with it. She heard that. She filed it. She served lunch to 4 men who treated her like furniture, which she had expected. The 2 young hands, neither of them past 20, both of them carrying the particular exhaustion of people who'd been doing too much for too long, ate fast and kept their eyes down. Gus ate slowly. Roan came in last, sat at the far end of the table, and worked through a bowl of beans and 2 pieces of cornbread while reading a ledger, turning pages one-handed. She refilled his water without being asked. He didn't look up. She went back to the kitchen. She was not offended. She had worked enough places to know that acknowledgement was a luxury, not a wage, and she wasn't here to be noticed. She was here because the notice said what it said, and she had exactly nothing left to lose, and she had found in the past 2 years of losing everything, that nothing left to lose was its own peculiar kind of freedom. She was washing the noon dishes when she heard it. 2 voices outside. Roan's low, controlled, and another she didn't know. Higher, harder. The voice of a man making a point he'd made before and was tired of being refused on. She didn't stop washing. She listened. Can't run a ranch on stubbornness, Callister. You're down 40 head from spring. The water table on your south pasture is dropping. And now the hay. I know what I'm down, Holt. Do you? Because men who know what they're down don't let it get this far. A pause. The Meridian Cattle Group is still interested. Good money. Enough to start clean somewhere the altitude doesn't fight you. I'm not starting clean anywhere. Roan. This is my father's land, Roan said. The 4 words were flat and final and carried underneath them something that was not argument, but bedrock. Get off it! Footsteps, the sound of a horse leaving. Then nothing but wind and the creak of the house settling. Clara set the last bowl on the shelf. She thought about the burned hay. She thought about the way Gus had said, "That's what he said," and meant something different. She thought about a man named Holt who knew exactly how bad things were and had a buyer ready. She was beginning to understand the shape of something. That evening, she carried coffee out to the porch, where Rowan sat with the ledger again, because the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Gus had disappeared somewhere, and nobody else was doing it, and he needed to eat and drink, regardless of whether he remembered to want to. He looked up when she set the cup down. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's done," she said, and turned to go. "Briggs?" She stopped. When she turned back, he was looking at her with that same direct measuring attention, but something in it had changed. Something that had moved just slightly from assessment towards something she didn't have a clean word for yet. "Where'd you come from before this?" he said. "Moved around. Kitchen work outside of Harding. Laundry before that. My husband died 4 years back and I lost the farm after." She said it plainly without the apology she used to put around it. "I know what the end of a thing looks like, Mr. Callister, if that's what you're trying to figure out." He held her eyes. "That ain't what I'm trying to figure out," he said quietly. She waited. "Supper was the first decent meal this kitchen's made in a month," he said. 2 sentences. From Rowan Callister, she was already learning that was a speech. She went back inside. She stood in the warm kitchen dark, and she let herself feel it just for a moment. Just the particular stubborn warmth of being recognized for something real by a person who clearly didn't hand out recognition cheaply. Then she folded it away and went back to work. She was up before first light. She had always been a before first light person, not by virtue, but by necessity, which over enough years amounts to the same thing. She made the fire, started the coffee, and stood at the back doorway while it heated and looked out at the land. It was dry, visibly deeply dry, the kind of dry that accumulates over seasons and carves itself into the land's face permanently if nothing changes. The near pasture grass was pale. The creek she could see from the doorway was thin and slow. She could hear the cattle from the far pen sounding lean. But she looked past all of it. She had been looking at land her whole life, the way her father had taught her to look not at the surface but through it, reading the grade and the drainage and the color changes the way other people read words. He'd told her the land always tells you the truth. He'd told her most people are just too busy talking to listen. She looked north, toward the ridgeline that ran along the back of the property. There at the base of the slope, a slight hollow. Darker earth. A thin scatter of scrub that had no business being as green as it was given the drought conditions around it. She went very still. It might be nothing. She thought about it all through breakfast and kept her mouth shut. In the early afternoon, she told the younger of the 2 hands, a gap-toothed boy named Eddie, that she needed to check the north fence for a question about supply storage, and could he point her toward it. He pointed. She walked out there alone. The ridge was farther than it looked. The day was full summer hot, and by the time she reached the base of it, her dress was soaked through and her feet were talking to her about her choices. But she crouched at that darker patch of earth, and she pressed her palm against the soil and held it there. Cool. Distinctly, undeniably cool. Damp below the surface crust, in a way the surrounding ground was not. She closed her eyes. Water, she thought. Deep water. 8 feet, maybe 10, maybe more, but there. She stood up slowly. She looked at the old fence line running east-west along the ridge base. The posts were ancient black, with age driven deep, the kind of construction that used to be standard before people understood what could be underground. Driven through something, blocking something. She stood there a long time. Then she walked back. Rowan was in the yard when she returned, talking low with Gus. Both of them stopped when she came into range. He looked at her, at the dust on her hem, the sweat, the purposeful exhaustion of someone who'd been somewhere specific. "Where have you been?" he said. "Walking your north fence line." She His jaw shifted. That wasn't part of the arrangement. No, she agreed. But I think you need to hear what I found. Something moved behind his eyes. And what? He said carefully, do you think you found? She looked at him steadily. I think you have water on this property that you don't know about, she said. And I think that old fence line along the ridge might be exactly why you can't get to it. A silence opened up between them. Gus looked at Roan. Roan looked at Clara. You walked my fence line, he said. I did. To check a supply question. She held his gaze. I may have gotten curious about more than that. Gus made a sound, not quite a laugh, but the edges of one. He turned away to cover it. Roan didn't look amused. But he didn't look dismissive either. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her since the moment she climbed down from that wagon, like something that kept defying the calculation he kept making about it. Come inside, he said. Show me on the map. She followed him in, and the day felt different than it had that morning. Not fixed, not saved, not any kind of resolved. Just shifted. Turned a degree towards something that wasn't the direction everything had been going before she got here. Which was, for now, more than enough. The map was older than the ranch itself. Roan spread it across the kitchen table without ceremony, holding one curling corner down with his coffee cup and the other with his fist, and Clara leaned over it and studied it the way she studied everything quietly, without rushing to conclusions, letting the information come to her rather than reaching for it. Gus stood to the side and said nothing. He was good at that. Show me where you were, Roan said. She put her finger on the ridgeline, traced it east along the base, stopped where the old fence ran parallel to the slope. Here, she said. The soil changes color, darker even in this heat, and it's cooler than it has any right to be. He looked at where her finger rested. Then he looked at her. That ground's been dry as long as I've owned this property, he said. As long as my father owned it before me. Then something changed it. Or something's been blocking it. She pulled her hand back. When was that fence put in? He looked at Gus. Before your father's time, Gus said. Old construction, deep posts. 8 feet minimum, that's how they sank them back then. Wanted the line to outlast the men who built it. 8 feet, Clara said. She was quiet for a moment, working through it. If those posts drove through a subsurface channel, even a narrow one, and the ground packed around them over decades, water finds its path. Block the path long enough and it backs up, or it reroutes, or it just sits there under the surface going nowhere. She paused. What's downstream of that fence line dries out. Slowly. Over years. Slow enough that nobody connects it to the fence. The kitchen was very still. Roan looked at the map. His jaw was set. You're telling me, he said slowly and precisely, that a fence put in before I was born might be strangling my water table. I'm telling you it's possible. I'm telling you the ground says something's there. She met his eyes. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But I'd rather you looked and proved me wrong than neither of us looked at all. He stared at the map for a long moment. Then he straightened and looked at Gus with the particular economy of a man who has made a decision and is done making it. Tomorrow morning, he said, we ride the North Ridge. Gus nodded, once the single nod of a man who doesn't waste motion any more than his employer wastes words. Clara moved toward the stove because supper still needed finishing, and the world didn't stop for water theories. Briggs, Roan said. She turned. You come too, he said. She didn't let herself react. She nodded and went back to the stove and kept her hands busy so they wouldn't shake, because that stubborn coal she'd been carrying in her chest was burning hotter than she'd allowed it to in a very long time, and she didn't trust herself to look at it directly yet. Morning came in hot and windless. Clara had breakfast on the table before anyone else was moving. She hadn't slept much. She never slept much when something was about to be either proven or destroyed. Her mind had always been that way, running scenarios in the dark, whether she gave it permission or not. The 2 hands came in first. Eddie, the gap-toothed one, and a quieter boy named Sam, who was maybe 17, and had the serious eyes of a kid who'd grown up faster than he should have. They ate quickly, trading glances the way young people do when the air around the adults is charged with something they can sense but haven't been told about. It was Eddie who finally said it. "You really think there's water under that ridge, ma'am?" Clara set more cornbread on the table. "I think it's worth finding out. Sam and me walked that ground plenty of times. Never seemed like anything but hard dirt. Most things don't reveal themselves to people who aren't looking for them specifically," she said. Sam looked up. He had a way of listening that was older than his face. "What do you look for?" She thought about it honestly before she answered. "Temperature, color, the way certain plants grow where the soil shouldn't support them." She set the pan down. "Land talks. It just doesn't talk in words." Sam was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness of someone young enough to still ask what he actually wanted to know, "Where'd you learn that?" "My father," she said. "He could read land the way other men read newspapers. He used to say if you're quiet enough and patient enough, the ground will tell you everything it knows." "What happened to him?" Sam said. Eddie shot him a look that said that might have been too much. But Clara just said, "Drought, then debt, then the bank." She picked up the pan and went back to the stove. "That's why I know it's worth looking." Neither boy said anything after that. But Sam ate the rest of his breakfast with a thoughtful expression that hadn't been there before, and she filed that away because she had always paid attention to the people nobody else thought to watch. Gus came in next, poured his own coffee, stood by the window looking north. Roan came in last. He sat down, ate fast, didn't touch the ledger. That was new. Every other meal she'd served him, the ledger had been there like a third-place setting. Its absence this morning told her his mind was already on the ridge, already running ahead of the food and the coffee and the routine, already out there working on something she hadn't given him yet. She hoped she hadn't made him a promise the ground couldn't keep. He pushed back from the table and stood. "Let's go," he said. They rode out 4 across Roan, leading Gus to his left. Clara on a steady older mare that Gus had saddled without being asked or told, Eddie trailing at the back. Clara hadn't been on a horse in almost 2 years. Her body remembered the mechanics before her mind caught up the weight shift, the give of it, the way you stop bracing and let the animal carry you. The mare was patient. She appreciated that. Roan set a pace that was businesslike without being punishing. They covered the ground to the north ridge in under 30 minutes, and he pulled up at the fence line and looked at it the way he looked at everything, with a stripped-down attention that made room for what was actually there, rather than what he expected to see. The fence was old enough to have its own history. The posts had gone dark with decades, the wire repaired in so many places the repairs had become structural. It looked like something that had been outlasting the people who built it for so long. It had forgotten they were ever there. Roan dismounted, walked to the nearest post, crouched, and pressed his hand to the soil around its base. Clara dismounted and went to the spot she'd found the day before. She pressed her boot toe against the ground, still cool, still wrong for the season. The difference was subtle if you weren't expecting it, and unmistakable if you were. "Feel the ground here," she said to Gus. He crouched beside her, pressed his palm flat, held it, lifted it, pressed again. One long beat of silence. "Huh," he said. From Gus' heart, that single syllable was a testament. Roan crossed to them and did the same thing, his hand against the earth, patient. Then he stood and looked at the fence line, at the long run of it east to west along the ridge base, and she could see something working behind his eyes, some calculation assembling itself piece by piece. 8 feet deep, he said. The posts. That's what Gus said. He looked east, then west, measuring something in his head. "If we're wrong," he said, "we pull a fence that didn't need pulling, and we're out 2 days' work." "Yes," she said. "And if we're right." She looked at him steadily. "If we're right, you get your water back. And you rebuild the herd in a season instead of watching it decline for another one." The wind moved through without doing anything useful. Then Rowan looked at Gus and said, "Get the tools." They didn't pull the fence that afternoon. The light ran out before he finished the planning and gather the right equipment, and Rowan was not a man who started something important halfway. But something had already shifted by the time they rode back, some quality in the silence between the four of them that felt less like absence and more like readiness. At supper, the two boys were louder than usual. Hope, even borrowed hope, makes young men noisy, and Clara found she didn't mind it. The kitchen felt fuller than it had the night before. Rowan ate quietly at the end of the table. He didn't read the ledger. Twice during the meal, she caught him looking at her across the table in that particular way of his. Both times, she looked away before she could read what was in it. The third time, she didn't look away fast enough. He looked back at his food without expression. After supper, she was at the wash basin when Gus appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You want something?" she said without turning. "Just checking," he said. "Checking what?" "Whether you're as calm as you look." She turned then. He was leaning in the frame with his arms crossed, that weathered face, giving away precisely nothing as always. "I'm not calm," she said. "I just don't see the point in advertising it." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "Smart woman?" She turned back to the basin. "Gus," she said. "The fire last month, the hay." She kept her voice even. "You don't think it was an accident?" A pause. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." She set a pot on the shelf. "And the man who came yesterday? Holt." He knew exactly how bad things were out here. He had numbers. He knew about the water table in the south pasture and the head count and the hay loss. She turned to face him. "That's not a neighbor being neighborly. That's someone who's been keeping a ledger on this place." Gus looked at her for a long moment with those flat, careful eyes. "That's a heavy thing to say about a man," he said. "I'm not saying it to him," she said. "I'm saying it to you." The silence stretched. "I think," Gus said, choosing each word like he was stepping on ice, "that it would be worth paying attention to what goes wrong next, and who stands to gain from it." He pushed off the doorframe and walked out, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen with the shape of something settling into her, the shape of a thing that was bigger than a dried-out ranch and a water table problem, something with edges she couldn't see all of yet. She went back to work. She always went back to work. The fence came down on Thursday, all four of them, Rowan, Gus, Eddie, and Sam, working from first light with iron bars, and the specific silent determination of men doing something that matters. Clara kept water and food moving to them through the morning, and watched from close enough to see without being in the way, cataloging each post as it came out, the way her father had taught her to catalog things not in writing in her body, in the part of her that stored what she'd learned before she knew she was learning it. The sixth post came out wet. Not damp. Wet. Dark at the base, gleaming the color of earth that has been holding water for a long time and has finally been told it can let go. Sam saw it first and made a sound that wasn't a word. Eddie dropped to his knees and put his hand in the hole and pulled it back with mud on his fingers and stared at it like he was holding something that had been lost. Gus looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Clara. She didn't smile. It was too early for smiling. They had a hole in the ground and wet mud, and nothing proven yet except that something was there. But she held his gaze for one full steady beat, and then she looked back at the hole. "Pull the next 4 posts east," she said, "and 3 west. Give the channel room to breathe." Nobody asked her if she was sure. They pulled the posts. By midday the water was moving. Not in a rush, nothing so dramatic. A slow, dark seep that widened as the earth around it adjusted to a pressure it had been carrying for decades, finally releasing, finding the slope it had always known was there. It moved east along the natural grade of the land, following a channel that had existed long before the fence, long before anyone named Callister had put a claim on this ground. Rowan stood at the edge of it and watched it move. Clara stood beside him. Not behind, beside. She wanted to say something practical. What came next? How to direct the flow? How long before they'd see a difference? She said nothing, because this was his land and his water, and this moment belonged to him in a way she had no right to interrupt. My father broke ground on this place with 2 other men and a mule, Roan said. He wasn't talking to her exactly. He was talking to the ground or to his father or to the 30 years of work that had led to this morning. He told me there wasn't better land in the high country, told me it would outlast everything else. A pause. I stopped believing him about a year ago. You can start again, she said quietly. He looked at her. The summer light was full and unsparing, and it showed everything. The exhaustion in his face, the grief that lived somewhere behind his eyes as a permanent resident, the way he held himself like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. How did you know? He said. About the fence. I didn't know, she said. I thought I saw something. There's a difference. You were sure enough to say it. I was sure enough that being wrong was cheaper than staying silent. She met his eyes. That's not the same thing as knowing. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the answer required. Then Gus called from 30 feet away that the east flow was picking up speed, and the moment ended and they both moved toward the work that was still waiting, and the water kept moving beneath them, slow and dark, and absolutely certain of where it was going. The cattle found it before noon. They always know. You don't show them. Something in them recognizes water, the way starved things recognize anything they've been denied long enough, and the first animal that caught the scent simply changed direction, and the rest followed with the purposeful urgency of creatures who have been wanting something and have suddenly understood that the wanting is over. Eddie laughed out loud. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind a 19-year-old boy produces when he forgets for a moment that he's supposed to be composed. Sam was grinning so wide it looked like it might stay that way. Even Gus, who had the emotional range of weathered timber, shook his head slowly in a way that Clara had already learned was as close to joy as he got. Rowan watched his cattle drink. He stood apart from the others, arms crossed, and he watched them, and Clara watched him watch them, and she thought about what it does to a person's body when even one piece of a weight lifts. Not the whole thing, not the relief of it being over, just the relief of one corner coming up from the ground. She went back to the house and started supper. When they came in that evening, the kitchen felt like a different room than it had the week before. The boys talked over each other. Gus made 2 dry observations that were somehow funnier than anything either boy said. Clara kept food on the table and listened to the sound of people who'd been bracing against something and were now for one evening standing upright. Roan came in last. He sat. He looked at his plate. Then he looked up at her. Thank you, he said. 2 words, plainly said without performance or qualification. From Rowan Callister, they landed with the weight of a longer speech. Don't thank me yet, she said. The water's moving. That's the beginning. The corner of his mouth moved. She was learning the geography of that, the fractional shift that on most men's faces would have been a full smile, and on his was something more carefully rationed. She went back to the kitchen before she could read too much into it. 2 days later, Holt came back. He brought a lawyer this time. Clara saw them from the window, Holt in his clean coat, and beside him a thin man in a dark suit carrying a satchel, and wearing the expression of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news while remaining technically pleasant about it. She went to the main room, where Roan was going over feed calculations. Holt's here, she said. With a lawyer. He was already standing. Stay close, he said. She blinked. Last time you wanted me out of the way. Last time I didn't know what we were dealing with. He looked at her directly. You've been on this property. You've seen things. If this goes where I think it might... He stopped. Started again. Just stay close. They walked out together. Holt saw it. She watched him see it, the together of it, and watched his eyes move from Roan to her, and back in a quick recalibrating look that he covered immediately with his standard-issue pleasantness. Callister, he said. Good afternoon. This is Mr. Harmon representing the Meridian Cattle Group out of Amarillo. Roan said nothing. Harmon opened his satchel with the efficiency of a man who does this regularly. Mr. Callister, my clients have authorized a formal acquisition offer for the Ridge property, including all water rights, grazing rights, existing structures, and livestock. He produced a folded document. The offer reflects current market conditions and the operational challenges you've been managing. Current market conditions, Rowan said. Yes, sir. Drought has suppressed land values significantly in the high country this season. Water access is a primary concern for any buyer. We found water, Rowan said. Harmon stopped mid-sentence. On the north pasture, 3 days ago. Moving now, feeding the east troughs, heading for the lower pasture by the end of the week. He looked at Holt, not the lawyer. Good water, consistent flow, enough to rebuild the herd by spring. Holt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes adjusted the way a man's eyes adjust when something he counted on turns out not to be there. That's encouraging, Holt said. One water source doesn't fundamentally change the larger picture. We also lost cattle, Rowan said. Funny thing about how they died. Not drought, not disease. Died the way animals die when something gets in their water that doesn't belong there. He held Holt's gaze. We documented the troughs, documented the tracks around them, tracks that came from outside the property line. A silence with weight in it. That's a serious implication, Holt said. I didn't imply anything, Rowan said. I told you what the evidence says. What you do with that is your concern. Harmon was still holding the document. He had the look of a man recalculating his afternoon. The offer? He began. No, Rowan said. Final, as a door latching shut. Holt looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then, that pleasant expression thinned into something cooler and more deliberate. You're sure about that, Rowan? Get off my land, Rowan said. Same tone as before. Quiet, absolute. They went. This time, the horses left at a pace that was slightly faster than they'd arrived at, and that detail, small as it was, told Clara something useful about how rattled Holt actually was underneath the composure. She and Rowan stood in the yard until the sound of them faded. He'll come back, she said. I know. Or he'll send someone he doesn't have to be seen with. I know that too. He turned to look at her, and in the full afternoon light, she could see something working in his face, not fear, not defeat, but the particular expression of a man who is done being patient and has made peace with what comes next. I need everything we've documented to be organized, everything we've found, everything you've seen. In writing. In order. I can do that tonight. And Clara... He stopped. She waited. That man in there, he said. Harmon. He had figures about this ranch. Specific figures. Head count, water table readings, current market value per acre. He paused. That's not information Holt would have from driving past on the road. She looked at him. Someone's been feeding him information, she said. Someone who has access to it. They looked at each other. How many people know the exact numbers, she said. The hands, Gus. He paused. And the county assessor, who sent a man out in April for the annual review. Who's the county assessor? He said the name. She didn't recognize it, but she filed it. That night, she wrote everything down. She sat at the kitchen table after the house went quiet, and she wrote in the careful, deliberate hand her mother had drilled into her, the dead calf, the troughs, the oily residue, the tracks along the east fence, the pipe along the property line they'd found, and the residue there, the dates, the details, what she'd seen, and what she'd concluded, and what she couldn't yet prove. She signed her name to it, dated it. Then she wrote a separate account of Holt's 2 visits, what he'd said, the specific figures Harmon had quoted, the offer amount which she'd seen on the document, even though she'd pretended not to. She was still writing when Rowan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw her. What are you doing? He said. Making a record, she said. Sit down. He sat down across from her, which she hadn't actually expected. He picked up the first page she'd finished and read it without speaking. He read it slowly. She kept writing. When he set it down, he was quiet for a moment. You remembered all of this, he said. I paid attention, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her across the table in the low kitchen light, and something in his expression was different from all the previous versions of that look. The fence-mending assessment, the measuring attention, the careful reserve. This was something that had moved past all of that into territory he hadn't planned to enter, and she could see him recognizing it and not knowing quite what to do with the recognition. She kept writing. My wife used to say. He started and then stopped. She didn't look up. She gave him the silence. She used to say that the ranch would outlast both of us, he said, because land doesn't have a choice about it. But people do. He paused. She meant it as a comfort, that we got to choose to stay. Clara set down the pen. She looked at him. She was right, she said. You're still choosing. He held her eyes. So are you, he said quietly. The kitchen was very still around them. Outside, the water ran east through the channel they'd freed, and the cattle shifted in the dark pens, and the summer night pressed down warm and enormous on the ridge. She picked up the pen. She kept writing, and Roan Callister sat across from her in the kitchen his father had built and watched her work and didn't leave, and the lamp burned between them, and neither of them said anything else. And what passed between them in that silence was more than most people manage with a great many words. She finished writing just past midnight. 12 pages. Everything she'd seen, everything she'd heard, every date and detail she could pull from memory, organized in the careful order of someone who understood that facts only protected you if they were arranged to be believed. She signed the last page, set down the pen, and looked at what she'd made. Roan had fallen asleep in the chair across from her, somewhere around the 10th page. Not deeply, just the sleep of a man whose body had finally overruled his intention to stay awake. His head was tilted against the back of the chair, and in sleep, his face lost some of what it carried during waking hours. Not all of it, but some. She looked at him for exactly 1 moment. Then she stacked the pages, left them in the center of the table where he'd find them, and went to bed. He had read everything by breakfast. She knew because he was already at the table when she came in to start the fire, the pages in a neat stack beside his coffee cup, and he was looking at the surface of the table, the way a man looks at something he's just finished understanding. He looked up when she came in. The county assessor, he said. His name is Pruitt. He's been assessor for 11 years. He paused. He and Holt went to school together. Same town, same year. I didn't know that until this morning. I went looking. She stopped in the doorway. You've been up since before me, she said. I don't sleep much, he said, which she was beginning to understand was simply true and not a complaint. She went to the stove. What does that connection give us? It gives us a reason. Pruitt does the annual land assessment. He has access to water table readings, head counts, everything Harmon was quoting yesterday. He watched her move around the kitchen. If Pruitt's been feeding Holt information, giving him a precise picture of how close to the edge this ranch is, then Holt knew exactly when to push and exactly how hard. That's not criminal by itself, she said. No, but it's the beginning of a pattern. He picked up the pages. Combined with what's in here, combined with the contaminated troughs and the tracks and the hayfire, it stops looking like a series of bad luck and starts looking like a campaign. The word hung in the kitchen air. Campaign. The word of a man who had stopped being confused and started being angry, which Clara understood, was actually the safer of the two states, because anger had direction. You need to go to the law, she said. The sheriff in this county is... I know, she said, but you need the record. Even if nothing comes of it immediately, you need documentation that you reported it. Because if this becomes a legal dispute over the land, you need a paper trail that shows you were a target, not a struggling rancher who gave up. He looked at her. You think like someone who's been on the losing end of a legal dispute, he said. I've watched what happens when you're right, but you can't prove it, she said. My father was right about everything, and it didn't save a single acre. She turned from the stove to face him. Being right isn't enough. Being right and documented is something different. He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll ride to town this afternoon," he said. "Gus comes with me." Good. She turned back to the stove. "And Roan, don't tell the sheriff more than what's in those pages. Just what's documented. Not what we think. What we can point to." A pause. "We," he said. She didn't miss it. She didn't address it either. She just kept cooking. But the word settled somewhere inside her and stayed. They were gone most of the afternoon. Clara used the time the way she always used waiting, by doing the things that needed doing, and not pretending the waiting wasn't happening. She checked on the cattle every hour. She took inventory of the smoke shed, and started a fresh batch of salt beef, because the work needed doing, and because working with her hands was the only thing that quieted her mind reliably. Sam found her in the smoke shed around 2 in the afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he said anything. That was Sam's way, he observed before he committed. "Miss Briggs," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Do you think Mr. Callister's going to lose the ranch?" She looked at him directly. He deserved that. "Not if I can help it," she said. Sam absorbed that. "What can you do? You're the cook." "I'm more than the cook, and you know it," she said without heat. "And you can do more than tend cattle. What matters is whether you're willing to." He stood up a little straighter. "What do you need?" "I need you to keep watching the east fence line after dark. You and Eddie alternating nights. Don't confront anyone. Don't make yourself known. Just watch and remember what you see." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Sam, if you see anyone near that fence line or the water pipe, you come to me first. Not Eddie. Me." He nodded with the gravity of someone given a real task for the first time and taking it seriously. "Yes, ma'am," he said again and left. She went back to the salt beef. 30 minutes later, she heard a horse in the yard, and her stomach tightened. She came out of the smoke shed and saw that it was only Doss making an unscheduled run with a small delivery, and she made herself breathe normally and went to meet him. Doss climbed down from the wagon with a small crate and a large expression. "Town's talking," he said before she could ask. "About what?" "About Holt and the Meridian Group making a formal offer on this place." He set the crate down. "And about the federal land surveyor who was seen at the county office 2 days ago asking questions about water rights in this area." Clara went still. "Federal surveyor," she said. "That's what they're saying. Nobody knows why exactly, but Pruitt's been in and out of the county office every day this week, which ain't like him. That man usually conducts business from wherever he's eating lunch." Doss looked at her with his sideways knowing look. "Somebody's stirring something up." She kept her face neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Doss smiled his not-quite smile. "No," he said. "I reckon you wouldn't." He left her with the crate and a great deal to think about. A federal surveyor. She hadn't expected that. She didn't know yet whether it was connected to Holt or independent of him, whether it was something that would help Roan or make the situation more complicated. She turned it over in her mind all the way back to the kitchen and was still turning it when Roan and Gus came back at dusk. She read the result in their faces before either of them said a word. Gus looked like he'd been asked to eat something he found disagreeable. Roan looked like a man who had expected disappointment and received exactly what he'd expected, which is somehow always worse than being surprised by it. She poured coffee without being asked and set it on the table. "Sheriff took the report," Roan said. "Wrote it all down. Said he'd look into it." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "He and Holt have hunted together for 15 years. "The report exists," Clara said. "That's what matters right now." "You're not surprised," he said. "No." "You knew the sheriff wouldn't do anything." "I knew the report was still worth filing," she said. "There's a difference." She sat down across from him. "Doss came by this afternoon. He said there's a federal land surveyor in the county asking questions about water rights." Roan's eyes sharpened. Who sent him? Nobody knows. Maybe nobody sent him. Maybe Meridian Group has federal-level connections, and they're trying to establish a water rights claim before they finalize an acquisition offer. She paused. Or maybe someone else filed a complaint. Someone who wants the situation looked at from the outside. Gus said without looking up from his coffee. Someone like who? She looked at him. I don't know yet. But she had a thought she wasn't ready to say out loud. The thought kept her up again. She lay in the small room off the kitchen and listened to the ranch settle around her and ran through what she knew in the order she knew it. The hay fire, the contaminated troughs. Holt's specific knowledge of the ranch's financials. Pruitt's connection to Holt. The formal acquisition offer with figures that were insulting to anyone who understood what this land was worth, what it would be worth with the water running again. And now a federal surveyor appearing from nowhere asking questions. There was something she was missing. A piece that connected things she couldn't yet see as connected. She was still working on it when she heard the back door open. She was out of bed in seconds the way you move when you've been half waiting for something, her feet on the floor, her hand on the doorframe of her room. The kitchen was dark. She heard breathing and then a voice low and controlled. It's me, Roan said. She exhaled. What are you doing? Checking the troughs. She could hear him moving in the kitchen, the sound of a lamp being lit. Thought I heard something. Probably nothing. He paused. Go back to sleep. She came into the kitchen anyway because she was already awake and her heart was already running, and going back to sleep wasn't a realistic option. He was standing at the table with the lamp in his hand and the look of a man who had been lying awake same as her and had decided to do something about it rather than lie there anymore. You heard something, she said. Near the east fence. Sam's watching the east fence. I know, that's what woke me. He knocked on my window about an hour ago. Said someone had been moving along the fence line and then stopped. Whoever it was didn't come onto the property. Roan set the lamp down. Just watching. The word landed cold. Just watching. Someone standing at the property line in the dark, watching the ranch. Taking count. Or waiting for the right moment to do something that required knowing where everyone was first. Wake Gus, she said. Already did. He's out there. Then what are you doing in here? He looked at her. I didn't want you waking up to an empty house and not knowing why. The kitchen was very still. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, and she understood that this was something different from the fence and the water and the documented evidence. This was something personal. This was him accounting for her in a way that wasn't professional duty, and she felt it register in her chest with the particular weight of something she didn't have reliable defenses against. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Picked up the lamp. Lock the back door, he said, and went out the front. She locked the back door. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she got out the pages she'd written, and she added a new entry dated with the time someone observed watching east fence line from outside property boundary. Duration unknown. Sam Carter, ranch hand witness. She signed it. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. Chid. Morning brought Eddie to the kitchen with his face white and his hands not quite steady, and Clara had the full story out of him before Roan came in for breakfast. A dead calf in the south pen. Found at first light. And not Eddie said this carefully, like he was testing the words before committing to them, not the way animals die from drought. She was in the south pen before Roan got there. She crouched beside the animal the way she'd crouched beside the others. And she did what she'd done before, reading the body the way land reads looking for what was wrong and where the wrong was coming from. Same compound, same profile. But the source was new. There's a third water point, she said when Roan arrived behind her. He crouched on the other side of the calf. Where? Not a trough. Something they could reach without coming all the way onto the property. She looked up at him. The creek feed, the pipe that runs from the upper water down to the south pen. Gus said it runs along the east property line. Roan stood up fast. Gus was at the pen gate. He'd already been thinking the same thing. She could see it in the way he was looking at the east fence, not at the dead animal. "Open pipe," she said to him. "Most of the run," he said. "Quarter mile, maybe more." "They didn't need to come onto your land," she said. "They could reach that pipe from outside the fence." Roan looked at the calf one more time. His face was doing the thing it did when he was past anger and into something colder, a flatness, a compression, the look of a man running the full cost of something and arriving at a number that can't be paid. "Check the pipe," he said to Gus. "I want to know every point they could have accessed it." He looked at Eddie. "Get these animals separated. Fresh water from the main well only. Nothing from any feed line until I say." He looked at Sam. "Ride for Doc Hennessy. Today." Sam was gone before the sentence landed. Roan looked at Clara. "How long has this one been sick?" he said. "Longer than it looks," she said. "A couple of days at least, which means the exposure happened before we found the east pipe problem. There was already something in this water line before we were looking at it." He was quiet. "He's been running multiple points simultaneously," she said. "Yes." "Which means this isn't opportunistic. This is planned, coordinated." She held his gaze. "Roan, this goes beyond what a county sheriff in Holt's pocket is going to touch." "I know. You need federal involvement. Real federal involvement, not just a surveyor asking questions." "I know that too." He rubbed the back of his neck, the first unguarded gesture she'd seen from him, the gesture of a man who is tired in a way that goes past the body. "Gus has a contact. Federal Land Office in Amarillo. We went to school with his brother." He looked at her. "If I write the letter today, write it today," she said. "I'll document the pipe. I'll get Gus's statement about the construction and the access points. I'll have everything ready for the letter before noon." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to do all of this," he said. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "I do. Because if this ranch goes under, I'm back on the road. But that's not why." She paused and said the rest of it because it was true, and because she had stopped pretending with herself about it, even if she wasn't ready to say the whole of it to him. "I do it because it matters. This land matters. What you're trying to hold on to matters." She held his eyes. "And I think you know that's not just about wages." He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Doc Hennessy arrived before lunch. He was compact, efficient 60-something, with the particular energy of a man who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had stopped wasting motion on anything that didn't help. He looked at the sick cattle, asked Clara questions that told her he recognized a useful source of information and was extracting it cleanly, and gave his assessment without softening it. "Phosphorus compound," he said. "Agricultural grade. Consistent with what I'd expect from a rat control product, or certain herbicides both available at any supply store, neither regulated closely enough." He straightened. "The good news is, dilution saved them. They got it from the feed line rather than the source. These animals will recover." "How long?" Clara said. "A week for the worst of it. 2 before they're back to full weight." He looked at her steadily. "You caught it fast. Another day, and we'd be having a different conversation." She nodded. "Someone needs to watch them through the nights," he said. "That'll be me," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the assessing look of a professional who has identified a reliable source. "How long have you been here?" "Going on 3 weeks." He nodded slowly in the way of someone revising an estimate. "Callister's lucky," he said, and went to write up his findings without elaborating which she found she respected. Gus wrote his account of the pipe construction and the access points in the careful block letters of a man who didn't write often, but took it seriously when he did. 3 pages, signed, dated, with measurements and compass directions that Clara checked against the property map and found exact. She added his pages to hers. Roan wrote the letter to Amarillo at the kitchen table while she organized the documentation, and when he finished it, he slid it across to her without asking. She read it. She pushed it back. "Second paragraph," she said. "You're explaining too much. You want them to come investigate, not understand everything before they arrive." He read the second paragraph again. "What do I cut?" he said. "The part where you justify why you didn't report it sooner. They don't need to know that. It sounds defensive. Just state what happened and when and what you have to show them." He rewrote the second paragraph. He slid it back. She read it again. "Better," she said, and meant it. He folded it and addressed the envelope and handed it to Gus to take to town with the Evening Post, and then he sat back in the chair and looked at the stack of documentation on the table between them. 12 of her pages, 3 of Gus's Doc Hennessy's written assessment, the dated accounts of the trough checks and the pipe, and the night watcher on the fence line. "We built something," he said. It was a simple observation, but the way he said it was not simple at all. "Yes," she said. He looked at her across the table with that look that she kept telling herself she was misreading and kept finding she was not. "Clara," he said. She waited. "When you came here..." He stopped. Tried again. "You came because you had nowhere else to go." "Yes," she said. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "And now," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Now I'm somewhere I want to be," she said. "That's different from nowhere else to go." He held very still, the way he held still when something had landed, and he was letting it settle. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's very different." The kitchen was warm around them, and the lamp was low, and the documentation sat between them on the table, like the beginning of something, not just the record of what had been done, but the shape of what could come after. Neither of them moved toward it. Neither of them moved away. The knock came the next morning before breakfast. Not a friendly knock. The knock of someone who had authority or wanted to appear to 3 sharp raps that said, "This is official and you should treat it that way." Clara answered it because she was already in the kitchen and Roan was in the barn and Gus was somewhere she couldn't immediately place. The man on the step had a badge and a satchel and the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered unwelcome situations for a living. "Ma'am," he said, "I am looking for Mr. Roan Callister. I'm Deputy Land Commissioner, Ellard Territorial Office. I have a complaint to serve." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of complaint?" "Water diversion complaint, filed by a neighboring property. Alleges that recent modifications on the Ridgeline Ranch have unlawfully redirected water flow affecting adjacent land." She did not react. She was very careful not to react. "Mr. Callister is on the property," she said. "Come in. I'll get him." She went to the back door and sent Eddie running for the barn, and while she waited, she stood in the kitchen and ran through everything she knew at speed. The fence posts they'd pulled, the water that was now moving, the neighboring property, which could only be Holt's spread to the east, the only one close enough to claim water impact. Holt had filed a complaint with the Territorial Office before they'd even had time to get a response from Amarillo. He was moving faster than she'd expected, which meant he was more threatened than he'd appeared, which meant their documentation was working. Roan came in with mud on his boots and looked at Ellard with the flat, direct gaze he gave to things that needed to be understood before they could be dealt with. "Mr. Callister," Ellard said, and repeated what he'd told Clara. "I need to examine the modifications and hear your account before I can file my assessment." "You'll get both," Roan said. Then he looked at Clara. She was already moving toward the table. She spread the property map and laid 2 of her written pages beside it and looked at Ellard with the pleasant, competent expression of a woman who has everything in order and is happy to show you. "Mr. Ellard," she said, "I can explain the full history of the modification if that would help your assessment. I was present throughout." Ellard looked at her with the brief surprise of someone who had expected to manage a rancher and found a second person already prepared. "That would be useful," he said, sitting down. She began. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the pre-existing channel visible in the topography confirmed by soil temperature and composition. She talked about the fence construction methods of that era and what driving posts 8 feet into a clay subsoil does to subsurface water flow over decades. She used the word restoration 7 times because it was accurate, and because it was the right word legally, and she in his notes. She did not say diversion once. Roan sat beside her and said almost nothing, which was exactly right. His job was to be present and credible and let her build the picture, and he seemed to understand that without being told. Gus brought coffee at precisely the right moment. When she finished, Ellard looked at his notes for a long time. "You'll have a formal survey completed by when?" he said. "End of the month," she said without hesitation. "I'll need it before I can close the complaint." "You'll have it," she said. He closed his notebook, thanked them with the careful neutrality of a man who hadn't decided yet, but was leaning somewhere, and left. The moment his horse cleared the yard, Clara put her hands flat on the table and let herself breathe. "We don't have a survey," Roan said. "I know. You just told a territorial official. We have 3 weeks, she said. That's enough time to get a surveyor out here." She looked up at him. What we needed today was for him to leave without issuing a stop order. If he'd issued a stop order, Holt's complaint would freeze everything we're doing while it's under review. We can't afford that. He stared at her. "Clara," he said, "how do you know all of this?" She looked at him. "Because when my father lost our farm," she said, "there was a stop order and a land commissioner, and a man who knew how to use official processes to accomplish unofficial goals." She folded the pages. "I watched every step of it. I just didn't know how to stop it then." She met his eyes. "I know now." Something crossed his face that she couldn't name cleanly. It wasn't pity. It was something that acknowledged pain without trying to diminish it. Something that recognized what it cost to have learned what she knew the way she'd learned it. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your father's farm." "It was a long time ago," she said. And then, because it was true, and because he'd said it directly, it still matters. "I know it does," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the water ran east through the channel, steady and unremarkable, now doing what water does when you stop blocking it, just moving the way it had always been, trying to move patient, past any human capacity for patience, going exactly where it had always known it needed to go. She looked at Roan. He was already looking at her. And in the space between them, something that had been building since the map and the lamp and the 12 pages of documentation that neither of them had named yet pressed against the surface of the ordinary afternoon, like water against old fence posts. And she felt it, and he felt it, and neither of them said anything about it, because some things don't need to be named to be real. They just need to be felt. The letter from Amarillo arrived 6 days later. Clara was the one who took it from Doss because Roan was in the north pasture and Gus was with him, and the boys were working the fence they'd been reinforcing since the night watcher. She turned the envelope over in her hands and looked at the return address and felt something tighten in her chest that was equal parts hope and dread, the combination she'd learned to expect from official correspondence ever since the bank had started sending letters to her father's farm. She set it on the table and did not open it. She went back to the stove and kept working and waited. Roan came in 40 minutes later, saw the envelope, looked at her. "When?" he said. "Just now. Doss brought it." He picked it up, opened it, read it standing at the table, and she watched his face the way she watched everything that mattered carefully without performing her own reaction until she knew what she was reacting to. He set the letter down. "They're sending someone," he said. "Federal land investigator. Name's Creed. He'll be here within the week." She exhaled slowly. "And," she said, because there was always an "and" with official correspondence, always a condition tucked inside the good news, and he wants everything documented before he arrives. All physical evidence preserved, all witness statements signed, the pipe secured so it can be examined. Roan looked at the letter again. "He says the Meridian Cattle Group has a history. Other properties. Other complaints that never got traction because there wasn't enough documentation." He paused. "He says if what we've described holds up, if the evidence is as solid as the letter suggests, this could go beyond Holt." "How far beyond?" she said. The group itself, the principals, federal land fraud charges if the pattern across multiple properties can be established. He set the letter down flat on the table. He used the word prosecution. The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about her father, about the farm, about the bank letters and the land commissioner and the man who'd known how to use official processes the way Holt had been using them as weapons dressed up in paperwork. "What do you need me to do?" she said. He looked at her across the table. "I need the pipe sealed and marked so it can't be disturbed before Creed gets here," he said. "I need Gus and Doc Hennessy's statements recopied clean. Creed will want them readable by someone who isn't us." He paused. "And I need you to go into town." She looked at him. "The supply store," he said. "Rafferty's. If the compound came from somewhere in this county, and it had to, because bulk agricultural chemicals don't travel light, Rafferty's is the most likely source." He held her gaze. "I can't go. Holt knows my face, and he'll have people watching who I talk to. Gus is too recognizable." A pause. "But you've only been in town twice. Nobody's paying attention to you yet." "Yet," she said. "Clara." "I'll go," she said. "I just want you to hear yourself saying it." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, the specific discomfort of a man asking someone to take a risk he can't take himself. "I don't like it," he said. "I know you don't." She reached for her coat. "That's why I trust you." He caught the coat before she pulled it from the hook. Not roughly, just his hand on the sleeve, stopping the motion. She looked at him. "If anything feels wrong," he said. "Anything at all, you come back. You don't push, you don't stay to finish. You come back." "I will. I mean it." "So do I." She looked at him steadily. "And Roan, I've been doing difficult things in rooms full of people who underestimated me my whole life. I know how to stay invisible." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he let go of the coat. Doss took her in the next morning. She wore her plainest dress and carried a real list cornmeal lamp oil, salt thread, dried beans, because the best cover is always one that's also true. She'd learned that from watching her mother move through the world as a woman who needed things from people who had power over her. You gave them the truth they expected to see, and you kept the rest of yourself somewhere they weren't looking. Rafferty's General Store was exactly the kind of place she'd been in 100 versions of the informal center of a small town's information, the place where news moved through the aisles, the way creek water moves through channels, finding the low points and pooling there. She'd grown up around stores like it. She knew how they breathed. She took her time with the cornmeal. She read labels she already knew. She asked about the thread with the focused interest of a woman with a specific project. She let the conversation in the store move around her the way conversation does when the people having it don't think they're being observed. It landed on Ridgeline Ranch in 11 minutes. She knew because she was counting. "Heard Callister found water up on the North Ridge," said a man near the back. Heavyset hat pushed back the voice of someone who considers himself informed. "People are saying it changes things." "Changes what?" said a younger voice. "Whether the Meridian Group's offer goes through. Can't pressure a man into selling if he's got water again." A pause heavy with implication. "Some folks aren't happy about that." "What folks?" The heavy-set man didn't answer that directly. He just made a sound that was adjacent to a laugh and moved on to asking about harness leather. Clara moved to the dried beans. She was close enough to the counter now to watch Rafferty without watching him, the particular sideways attention she'd developed over years of being in rooms where she needed to know what was happening without appearing to track it. Rafferty was a careful man, mid-50s, methodical, the kind of person who kept his store the way he kept himself, orderly, accountable, not given to excess in any direction. He wasn't dishonest. She'd read that about him immediately. But he was the kind of careful that could be used by people who understood what questions not to ask. She brought her list to the counter. He added up her items with the practiced speed of a man who didn't need the pencil but used it out of habit. "I wanted to add something to the list," she said, setting a tin of lamp oil on the counter. We've got a problem with rats in the smoke shed. Someone mentioned a phosphorus-based compound, said it worked better than the traps. She tilted her head slightly. Do you carry anything like that? Rafferty's hand paused on the pencil. Just for a second. The kind of pause a careful man makes when a question touches something he's been thinking about. I carry a couple of products with that profile, he said. Small quantities, for general pest control. He turned to the lower shelf, pulled out a jar. This one's what most folks use. Someone said they'd gotten a bulk amount of something similar recently, she said pleasantly. Said it was very effective. I wondered if it was through you. Rafferty looked at her. Not suspiciously, just with the attention of a man making a small calculation. I don't do much bulk business in that category, he said. Had a special order a while back. Not something I'd typically stock in quantity. He set the jar on the counter. For rats in a smoke shed, this is plenty. You don't need bulk. Of course, she said. You're probably right. She bought what was on her list. She thanked him pleasantly. She made no further mention of phosphorus compounds or special orders, or anything that would cause Rafferty to remember the conversation as anything other than routine. She walked to the wagon and climbed up beside Doss, and sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward the road, and said nothing for 2 full miles. Then she said, He had a bulk special order, not standard stock. Customer wanted it handled quietly. He didn't say that, but he stopped himself from saying something, and that's the same thing. Doss kept his eyes on the road. How long ago? He said. He didn't say, but he said a while back, and he was uncomfortable enough that it's recent enough to still be uncomfortable. She looked at the road ahead. The compound that killed that calf and got into the pipe, it came from Rafferty's. And Rafferty knows it came from somewhere it shouldn't have gone. He won't say so, Doss said. Not to us, she said. But to a federal investigator with authority to compel his records, that's different. She paused. That's very different. Doss made his sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You know, he said, when I brought you out to that ranch 3 weeks ago, I thought Callister was going to send you back inside a week. I know, she said. I was wrong, he said. She didn't say anything, but she let herself feel it, the particular satisfaction of being underestimated and quietly, thoroughly proving it wrong. She'd been doing it her whole life. She'd just never had so much riding on it before. She told Rowan everything the moment she walked through the door. He listened the way he always listened, completely without interruption, his eyes on her face and his hands still on the table. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Rafferty will talk to Creed, he said. He'll have to. Federal investigator with a warrant doesn't give him the option of protecting a business relationship. She sat down. The question is the timing. Creed needs to get here before Holt realizes what we're building. If Holt figures out we have a federal investigator coming, and he has time to cover the supply chain. He can't cover what's already in Rafferty's ledger, Rowan said. He can apply pressure to Rafferty to have an accident with the relevant pages. She met his eyes. It's been done. Rowan looked at her steadily. What do you need? He said. I need to write down what Rafferty said, exactly what he said, and exactly what he stopped himself from saying, and why the distinction matters. Tonight, before the details soften. She reached for the pen that was already on the table because she'd put it there before she left that morning. And I need you to write to Creed again and tell him to expedite. Don't explain why in the letter. Just tell him the timeline is more pressing than the original communication suggested. Done, he said. She was already writing. He got up and got his own paper, and they worked at opposite ends of the table in the now familiar silence of 2 people who had learned how to share a room without either one diminishing the other. And outside, the summer evening pressed down on the ridge, and the cattle moved in the north pasture with the slightly different energy of animals that had found their footing again. And somewhere along the east fence line, Sam was beginning his watch and didn't know yet what the next 12 hours would bring. Chaptan. The twist came at midnight. Sam knocked on Roan's window at 12:15, and Roan was out of bed in seconds and at Clara's door in under a minute, and she was already awake, because she'd been listening not for anything specific, just in the way she'd been sleeping since she got to Ridgeline Ranch, with part of her always at the surface, always ready. 3 men, Roan said through her door. Along the east fence. Sam counted 3. She was dressed and through the door before he finished. Gus was already in the kitchen, which didn't surprise her anymore. Gus materialized where he was needed with the reliability of weather. 3, Gus said. And they're not watching this time. She looked at him. What are they doing? Moving, he said. Along the pipe run. The pipe. The evidence they'd sealed and marked for Creed. The physical proof that had no substitute in any document she could write the residue in the channel, the access marks the proof of repeated tampering that was irreplaceable once it was gone. If they destroy the pipe, she started. I know, Roan said. He was already moving for the door. Roan. She caught his arm. He stopped and looked at her. Don't go out there alone. I'm not alone, Gus. 3 men, she said. At midnight, with whatever they brought to destroy evidence. She held his gaze. Wake Eddie and Sam, all 4 of you. That takes time. 3 minutes, she said. Give me 3 minutes and we go out there with 4 people instead of 2. She looked at him. Please. He looked at her for 1 full second. 3 minutes, he said. She went and knocked on Eddie's door hard and told him to get dressed and get Roan's rifle from the cabinet. And she said it in the voice that she'd discovered sometime in the last 3 weeks. She had the voice that was not loud, but was not questioned, and Eddie moved without asking why. Sam was already at the back door with his boots on. Of course he was. They went out together. Roan first, Gus a step behind Eddie, and Sam flanking Clara behind them, because she wasn't armed and wouldn't pretend to be something she wasn't. But she was there, and she could run for help, and she could witness, and witnessing was its own kind of weapon. The east fence line was dark and quiet. Too quiet. Roan raised his hand and they all stopped. She heard it a half second after he did the soft sound of something being moved, something metallic, the specific sound of someone working at the pipe channel with a tool. Roan looked at Gus. Gus pointed. 30 feet. North along the fence. They moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean or cinematic. 3 men working at the pipe channel heard them coming, and one of them immediately disappeared into the dark beyond the fence line in seconds. The second hesitated a fraction too long, and Gus covered the distance between them with the speed of a man who had once been younger and had kept more of it than he looked, and the man went down when Gus's hand closed on his collar, went down hard, and stayed there. The third one ran north, and Eddie, 19 years old with young legs, and the specific outrage of someone who'd been taking care of these animals for months, ran after him and caught him at the property line and sat on him with his full considerable weight until Roan arrived. Sam stood over the pipe channel with a lantern. Clara came and looked. They had gotten there in time. The channel was disturbed. The sealing she'd done had been partially undone, the marked evidence partially displaced but not destroyed. The residue was still there. The access marks were still there. What they'd come to erase was still legible, just barely like a page that had been smudged but not torn out. She let out a breath that felt like it had been in her since midnight. It's intact, she said. Most of it. Roan stood beside her, looking at the channel. How much did they get? He said. Enough to see they tried, she said. Which is actually more useful than if they hadn't come at all. He looked at her. Attempted destruction of evidence, she said. Witnessed by 5 people, dated and documented tonight. She met his eyes. Creed will want this more than anything else we've given him. One of the captured men. The one Gus had taken a heavyset fellow who smelled like he'd been somewhere with a whiskey bottle before this was talking now. Not to any of them specifically, just talking the way frightened people talk when the alternative is silence. He was saying it wasn't his idea. He was saying he was paid. He was saying the name of the person who paid him with the particular speed of someone jettisoning weight to stay afloat. Roan listened. The name was not Holt. The name was Pruitt. The county assessor. Clara looked at Roan. Roan looked at her. Not Holt directly, she said, keeping her voice low and even. Holt's smart enough to use a middleman. Roan said, equally quiet. Which means there's a chain, she said. Pruitt takes the risk. Holt keeps distance. But if Pruitt is talking... She looked at the man Gus was holding. Pruitt will give Holt to Creed to save himself. Roan turned to Gus. Take them to the barn. Lock it. We send for the deputy in the morning, not the sheriff. The deputy. There's a deputy, she said. Creed briefed him before he wrote to us, Roan said. Said he had a man in the county he trusted. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it was relevant yet. She looked at him. You have been busy, she said. Something crossed his face. You're not the only one who makes plans at midnight, despite everything. The dark, the adrenaline, the two men in the barn, and the evidence that had nearly been destroyed, and the name Pruitt rattling around her head, she almost smiled. Almost. The deputy arrived at first light. His name was Marsh, and he was younger than she'd expected, 30 maybe, with the kind of face that hadn't fully settled yet, but had the eyes of someone who'd been watching the right things for long enough to know the difference between what people said and what they meant. He looked at the men in the barn. He looked at the pipe channel and the documentation. Clara handed him the account she'd written between 2 and 4 in the morning, dated, signed, specific. He read it slowly. He read it again. The name he gave, Marsh said to Roan. Pruitt. Yes. Is he certain? He said it 4 times without being asked, Roan said. Once to me, once to my foreman, twice on his own while we were waiting. Marsh closed the pages, looked at Clara. You wrote this between the incident and dawn, he said. Yes. All of it. I write things down when they happen, she said, waiting until morning costs detail. He looked at her for a moment with that assessing gaze. Mr. Creed is going to want to talk to you specifically, he said. I expected that, she said. He took the 2 men. He took her account and Gus's account and the sealed record of the pipe channel. He told Roan that Creed would be arriving in 2 days, not the end of the week, because the morning's events had accelerated the timeline on the federal end. He left. The ranch settled into a stunned, exhausted quiet. Eddie fell asleep at the breakfast table. Sam sat with his coffee and stared at nothing, with the look of a young man processing something that had moved faster than he'd been ready for. Gus drank his coffee, standing at the window, and said nothing, which was Gus's version of processing. Rowan sat across from Clara at the table. She looked at him. He looked like a man who had been running on intent and anger and the specific fuel of having something to protect, and who was now in the quiet aftermath beginning to feel the weight of what the last 8 hours had actually cost. You should sleep, she said. So should you. I'll sleep when Creed gets here. That's 2 days. I've gone longer, she said. He looked at her, the direct, full attention look that she'd stopped trying to deflect, because deflecting it cost more than she had to spare. Clara, he said. She waited. When this is over, he said. When Creed comes, and the evidence is submitted, and this thing runs its course. He stopped. He was not a man who said things before he was ready to say them completely, and she could see him taking the time he needed. I want to talk about what comes next. She looked at him. What comes next for the ranch? She said carefully. That too, he said. But not only that. The kitchen was warm, and the morning light was coming in full now, and outside the cattle were moving in the north pasture with the steady, purposeful sound of animals that had enough water and were rebuilding. Everything around them was the particular ordinary of a morning after crisis, the kind of ordinary that feels extraordinary, because 24 hours ago it wasn't guaranteed. She held his gaze. All right, she said. When this is over, we'll talk. He nodded once. She stood up and started clearing the table because the dishes still needed doing, and the world didn't stop for federal investigators or confessions or the particular look on a man's face when he says not only that and means it with everything he has. But her hands were not quite steady, and she did not mind. Creed arrived on a Thursday. He was not what she'd pictured. She'd been expecting someone like Ellard, official, neutral, careful. Creed was those things, but underneath them was something with more iron in it. He was a man who had been doing this work long enough to have developed opinions about people who used legal systems as weapons, and those opinions had compressed over time into something quiet and very dense, like a stone that has been in a river long enough to forget it was ever rough. He came alone. He came with a briefcase and a sealed letter from the Federal Land Office, and the kind of unhurried purpose that told her he'd already done more work on this than the letter had suggested. She had coffee on the table before he finished tying his horse. He noticed. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed. He sat down, opened the briefcase, and looked at Rowan. "Mr. Callister," he said. "Before we begin, I want you to know that the name Pruitt appears in 2 other files on my desk. 2 other properties. 2 other sets of circumstances where the county assessor's detailed knowledge of a failing operation preceded a Meridian Group acquisition offer." He paused. "We've been looking for the piece that connects those files. I believe you have it." Rowan looked at Clara. Clara slid the full stack of documentation across the table. Creed looked at the stack, looked at her. "You compiled this," he said. "Yes," she said. "All of it." "All of it, except the pages signed by Mr. Hart and Doc Hennessy." She met his eyes. "I witnessed everything they describe." He picked up the first page and began to read. He read for 20 minutes without speaking. He turned pages with the focused attention of a man extracting the structure of something from its details. And Clara watched him read and saw the moment he understood what he was holding. Saw it in the slight change of his posture, a barely perceptible settling like a man who has been carrying a partial map and has just been handed the piece that shows him where he is. He set the pages down. "Miss Briggs," he said, "how long have you been on this property?" 23 days, she said, a long pause. "And before that, laundry work, kitchen work. My husband died 4 years back. I've been moving since." He looked at her the way Doc Hennessy had looked at her, not with the quick dismissal of someone who'd decided she was irrelevant, but with the specific attention of a professional who has identified a resource and is recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the situation accordingly. "You'll testify to everything in these pages," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "In a federal proceeding." "Yes." He looked at Rowan. "Mr. Callister," he said, "I'm going to need to talk to your hands and your foreman individually. I'm going to need to examine the pipe channel and the water source before anything else is disturbed. And I'm going to need to have a conversation with a Mr. Rafferty in town that he is not going to enjoy." He closed the briefcase. "I'll be on this property for at least 3 days." "You'll have what you need," Rowan said. "I know I will," Creed said, and looked at Clara when he said it. She looked back at him steadily. Outside, the water ran east. Inside, something that had been tilting toward disaster for months held its ground, and then slowly, the way things change when they're built on something real, began to tilt the other way. Creed worked the way Clara worked, without wasted motion, without performance, without announcing what he was doing before he'd done it. He spent the first morning with the pipe channel crouching in the dirt, with a kit she hadn't seen before extracting samples, with the methodical patience of a man who understood that physical evidence was the spine of everything, and everything else was flesh around it. He didn't ask for help. He didn't explain his process. He just worked, and Clara kept coffee coming and stayed out of his way and watched him the way she watched everything that mattered, carefully learning. The second morning, he talked to Gus for 2 hours in the main room with the door closed. She heard almost none of it. She didn't try to. When Gus came out, he walked straight to the kitchen, poured himself coffee, and stood at the window with his back to her for a long moment. "He's thorough," Gus said. "Is that good?" she said. "It is if you're on the right side of it." He turned. His face was doing that thing it did when he'd said something difficult to someone who needed to hear it and was now processing the cost. "He asked me about the fire. The hay fire. In June." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him what I knew," Gus said. which was more than I'd told Roan. He wrapped both hands around the cup. I found something the morning after the fire. Piece of cloth caught on the east fence post inside the property line, not outside. Too far from where anyone on this ranch would have been. He paused. I took it. Put it away. Didn't say anything because I didn't want to put it in Rowan's head without being sure. Clara set down what she was holding. You had evidence of arson, she said, since June. I had a piece of cloth, he said, which could have been nothing. But you kept it. I kept it. He looked at her steadily. I gave it to Creed this morning. She was quiet for a moment. Does Roan know? Creed's talking to him now. She looked toward the closed office door. She thought about what it cost a man like Gus to carry something like that for months. Not dishonesty, but a specific kind of protection, the kind that holds information back until it can be used rather than just felt. She understood it. She didn't entirely agree with it, but she understood it. Gus, she said. I know, he said before she could finish. I should have said something sooner. That's not what I was going to say. He looked at her. I was going to say that piece of cloth might be what closes this whole thing, she said. So whatever you were carrying, you can put it down now. He looked at her for a long moment with those flat, careful eyes. You're a strange woman, Clara Briggs, he said. I know, she said. I've been told. The corner of his mouth moved. He went back to work. Roan came out of the office 40 minutes later. She heard the door and looked up, and she knew immediately from the way he moved that the conversation had changed something in him, not broken, anything but rearranged it. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them. The fire wasn't an accident, he said. No, she said quietly. I didn't think it was. Gus had a piece of cloth, since June. He didn't say it with anger, just with the weight of something that had been uncertain for a long time and was now certain, which is its own kind of grief, even when it's also relief. I know, he told me. Roan looked up. He told you first, he said. He told me right after he told Creed. She held his gaze. He needed somewhere to put it before he faced you with it. Something moved across Roan's face. Not hurt, but the adjustment of a man recalibrating what the last 3 months actually looked like now that he had all the pieces. Holt had someone on this property, he said. Before the fire. Before any of this started. Yes. Which means this wasn't opportunistic. He wasn't circling a ranch that happened to be struggling. He paused. He created the struggle. Yes, she said. I think so. He was quiet for a moment. My father built this place, he said. Not for the first time, but differently than before, with less grief in it and more anger. The kind of anger that has finally found its correct object after months of being turned inward. Holt never wanted to buy it. He wanted to take it. Yes, she said. And he came very close. Because I didn't see it. Because he was careful, and you were alone, and you were grieving, and you had no reason to look for something that deliberate. She looked at him directly. Stop accounting for that. It doesn't help anything. He looked at her. You don't do that, he said. You don't soften things. Most people. I'm not most people, she said. No, he said. You are not. The way he said it was not a compliment exactly, or not only a compliment. It was an acknowledgement, the kind that carries the weight of everything observed over time, the kind that cannot be manufactured or given prematurely, and means more because of that. Creed knocked on the kitchen door frame. They both looked at him. Mr. Callister, he said, the cloth fiber heart preserved, it matches the construction of a work jacket purchased from Rafferty's General Store. Common enough that it doesn't prove anything on its own. He paused. But combined with the ledger entry, the compound purchase, the pipe contamination, and the 2 men caught at the property line, it establishes a pattern of conduct over at least 4 months that goes well past civil dispute. He looked between them. I'll be filing my report tomorrow morning. I expect a warrant for Pruitt within the week. Holt will take longer. He's insulated himself carefully, but Pruitt will give him up. They always do. Roan said nothing for a moment. How long? He said finally. Before it's resolved, months. Federal proceedings move at their own pace. Creed said it without apology. But the immediate threat is over. No one is going to send men to your fence line once they know a federal investigator has been on this property and is filing a report. He paused. You're safe. The ranch is safe. What comes after is the law's problem. He went back to the office. Clara and Roan looked at each other across the kitchen. The word safe sat in the air between them. She had not felt safe in years. She had felt capable, which was different. She had felt resilient, which was also different. Safe was something else, something she'd stopped expecting the way you stop expecting something that hasn't happened in long enough. She felt it now, carefully, like pressing a hand against ground that might be solid or might give way, and finding it held. Chantuo. That evening, Doss came by with the post. 2 letters. One for Roan from the Territorial Land Office confirming receipt of Creed's preliminary report. One with no return address, which Roan opened and read and set down with an expression that made her ask immediately. What is it? He handed it to her. She read it. It was from Holt, not threatening. That was the first thing she noted. Not threatening, which was actually more alarming than threatening would have been, because it meant Holt knew enough to know that threats were now documented and dangerous to him personally. It was instead a single paragraph of careful language that said nothing specific and implied everything specific, that certain parties had become aware of the investigation, that certain parties believed a mutual resolution was preferable to a prolonged legal process, that certain parties were prepared to be generous in the interest of moving forward. Certain parties. 3 times in 4 sentences. He was trying to settle. Clara set the letter down. He knows, she said. Yes. He's scared. Yes. Don't respond to this, she said. Don't respond to anything from him through any channel that isn't Creed. If he's trying to settle quietly, it's because he knows what the evidence looks like from the outside, and he wants to contain it before it gets to the principals in Amarillo. Roan looked at the letter. He wants me to take money, he said, and be quiet about it. Yes. After everything he did to this ranch. Yes. His jaw tightened in the specific way it tightened when something in him was running very close to the surface, and he was deciding how much of it to let out. No, he said, flat and final. No, she agreed. He picked up the letter and took it to Creed's room and knocked on the door and gave it to him and came back with the empty expression of a man who has handed something off and is done with it. He sat down at the table. It's going to get louder before it's quiet, she said. I know. Are you ready for that? He looked at her. I've been ready since the morning I found the first trough, he said. I just didn't know yet what I was ready for. She nodded. He looked at her for a moment with that full direct attention. Clara, he said. I said I wanted to talk, when this was over. It's not over yet, she said. No, but it's far enough along. He didn't look away. I don't want to wait until everything is resolved to say something that's true right now. She was very still. All right, she said. He put his hands on the table, not toward her. Just there, open, visible, the gesture of a man who is not trying to reach for anything but wants her to see him clearly. When Margaret died, he said, I thought the ranch was what I had left. The only thing. I poured everything into it because everything else felt like standing in an open field with nothing to hold on to. He paused. I got good at needing nothing. I thought that was strength. She said nothing. She gave him the room. 3 weeks ago, a woman with a bag and no references climbed down from Doss's wagon before anyone could help her, he said, and looked at me like she was reading something, and I was the one who didn't know what the text said. The corner of his mouth moved. And I thought I had her figured out inside 5 minutes. Capable, temporary, someone who needed a job and would move on when things steadied. That was a reasonable assumption, she said. It was wrong, he said. And I know the exact moment I knew it was wrong. She looked at him. "When you went back into that kitchen, and you weren't offended that I didn't acknowledge the water refill," he said. "Not because you didn't notice, because you didn't need it." He paused. I'd never met a person who didn't need acknowledgement, and wasn't performing the not needing. You just didn't need it, because you were already somewhere else inside yourself, already full of something that didn't depend on me. She felt something move in her chest, not surprise, but recognition. The feeling of being seen accurately by someone who looked at things the right way and was saying what he found. "Roan," she said. "I'm not asking you to feel something you don't," he said. "I'm asking you to know what I feel. What I've been feeling since about day 4, which I'm aware is fast, and I can't apologize for it, because it was true." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't fill the silence. He waited the way he waited for everything completely without flinching. "When I came here," she said, "I had a list of things I was willing to want. Wages, a roof, work that meant something." She paused. "I had stopped letting myself want things that could be taken away, because everything I'd let myself want had been taken away, and I had gotten very efficient at not making that mistake again." He said nothing. "I stopped letting myself want things," she said again. "And then I got here, and there was this land that was dying, and a man who was alone in a way he didn't know how to talk about, and I couldn't help looking at both of them the way my father taught me to look at land." She met his eyes. Seeing what was really there, not what it looked like from the surface. "What did you see?" he said. "I saw something worth staying for," she said. "And I haven't let myself say that out loud until right now, because saying it makes it something that can be taken." He was very still. "I'm not going to take it," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I know that. That's why I'm saying it." The kitchen was warm and quiet around them, and outside the cattle moved in the north pasture and the water ran east in the channel they'd freed. And somewhere along the fence line, Sam was doing his watch with the steady seriousness of a young man who'd been given something real to protect, and had risen to it, and the whole ranch breathed around them in the particular way of a living thing that has come back from the edge. Roan reached across the table. He turned his hand palm up. She looked at it. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around it, not tight, not desperate, just certain. The grip of a man who has made a decision, and is done making it, and is now simply living inside it. They sat like that for a moment. "I should check on the cattle," she said. "In a minute," he said. She didn't argue. Pruitt was arrested on a Wednesday. Doss brought the news with the Morning Post and the expression of a man who considered himself an important node in the information network of Harlan County, which at this particular moment he was. "Sheriff's deputy and 2 federal men," Doss said, accepting the coffee Clara offered. Pruitt came out of his office and they were waiting. His lawyer arrived inside the hour, but by then he'd already said 3 things he shouldn't have said. He looked at her over the cup. "Town is talking about nothing else." "What are they saying?" she said. "Depends who you ask. Half of them say they're shocked. Other half say they always knew there was something off about Pruitt and the assessments he ran on struggling properties." He paused. "Rafferty went to see Creed on his own. Didn't wait to be compelled. Took his ledger in voluntarily and sat there for 2 hours. Good for Rafferty," she said. "He told Creed the customer who ordered the bulk compound asked him specifically not to record the name. Paid cash. Described him well enough that Creed identified him as one of Holt's regular contractors." Doss set down the cup. "The chain goes all the way up. That's what I'm hearing." Roan came in from the barn in time to catch the last of it. Doss filled him in on Pruitt and Rafferty, and the contractor, and Roan listened with the flat, absorbing attention he gave to everything, and when Doss finished, Roan said, "And Holt?" Doss' expression shifted, became careful the way expressions become careful when the news is significant. "Holt left," he said. Roan went still. "Left. 3 days ago. Closed up his property, took his horses, and nobody's seen him since." Doss looked at him steadily. "Creed knows. He's not running, or if he is, he can't run far enough. Federal fraud doesn't have county lines. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He ran, he said. Looks like. Because the evidence was solid enough that he knew what was coming, Clara said. Creed said the same thing, Doss said. Said a man who runs before the warrant is a man who's read the documentation and knows he can't argue his way out of it. He looked at her with that sideways knowing look. Said whoever built that documentation file built it airtight. She said nothing, but she felt it the particular satisfaction that had no good word in English, the feeling of having done something difficult and precise and consequential, and having it hold up under the weight that got put on it. Yeah, the surveyor came the following week. He spent 2 full days on the property with Roan and Gus, walking every water point, the North Ridge Channel, the pipe run, the troughs, the natural grade of the land, and what it implied about subsurface movement. He produced drawings and measurements and a formal document that established in the technical language of territorial land law that the Ridgeline Ranch water restoration was not a diversion, but a correction of an obstruction, and that the water that now ran east across Callahan land had belonged to that land by natural right for longer than any fence line in the county. Ellard's complaint was officially closed 3 days after the survey was filed. Clara read the closure notice at the kitchen table and set it down and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the document hadn't already said better. Roan sat across from her. "It's done," he said. "This part," she said. "Yes, this part." He looked at the notice. "Holt will be found. The federal case will run its course. Meridian Group is being looked at in 3 counties now." He paused. "But the ranch is clear." "Yes," she said. "The water's running," he said. "Yes." "The cattle are gaining weight. Doc Hennessy says the 2 sick animals will be fully recovered by the end of the month." He looked at her. "We have a real shot at rebuilding the herd before winter." "You always did," she said. "You just needed the water." He shook his head slowly. "I needed more than the water," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same expression he'd had across the table when he turned his hand over and waited, not asking for anything she wasn't ready to give. Just being clear about what was true for him, which she had come to understand was simply how he was built. No decoration, no performance. Just the plain truth of what he thought and felt offered without expectation. It was the most disarming thing about him. It had been the most disarming thing about him since about day 4. "Eddie came to me yesterday," she said. Rowan blinked at the change of subject. "What did he say?" "He said he wanted to learn to read land the way I do. Asked if I'd teach him." She looked at her coffee. "He said, and I'm quoting, 'I reckon if a person can find water under 30 years of dead ground, there's probably things about this land I don't know yet.'" A pause. "What did you tell him?" Rowan said. "I told him yes," she said. "I told him we'd start with the south pasture, which I think has a secondary channel that hasn't opened up yet." She looked up. "If I'm right about that, you could potentially double the east trough capacity before the dry season ends." He stared at her. "You've been reading the south pasture," he said. "I've been reading everything," she said. "I read land. It's what I do." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're planning to be here in the dry season," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm planning to be here a long time past the dry season," she said. Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not with any theater, just the particular opening of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has finally been told he can put it down. He stood up from the table. He walked around to her side of it, and he stood there, and she tipped her head back to look at him, and he reached down and took her hand and held it the way he'd held it across the table, with certainty, not urgency. "Come outside," he said. "I want to show you something." She stood. He didn't let go of her hand. He took her to the North Ridge. Not on horseback, they walked side by side in the full afternoon heat of a summer that was still relentless, but that no longer felt like an enemy. The grass in the near pasture was not green. It was not healed. but it was less pale than it had been 3 weeks ago, and here and there in the places where the water had reached first, there were patches of something that would be green given enough time. She saw it because she knew how to look. At the base of the ridge, he turned to face the channel. The water was moving steadily, dark and unhurried, following the grade east, the way it had always known to follow it, indifferent to the decades it had spent being blocked, and the 3 weeks it had spent being free, simply doing what water does when you stop trying to stop it. "My father stood here once," Rowan said. "Right here. He told me this was the best piece of land in the high country, and that if I ever doubted it, I should come back to this spot and look." He paused. "I stopped coming here after Margaret died. I couldn't stand what it felt like to stand somewhere he'd been happy." She was quiet. "I came here yesterday morning," he said. She looked at him. "It felt different," he said. "It felt like—" He stopped, tried again. "It felt like the land was telling me something, which I know sounds—" "It doesn't sound like anything," she said. "My father talked to land his whole life. Land talks back if you listen." He looked at her. "What did it sound like?" she said. "Yesterday morning." He was quiet for a moment. "It sounded like beginning," he said. She held his gaze. The water moved east between them and the ridge, and the summer pressed down on them both, and the cattle were somewhere behind them, moving in the direction of the troughs, and Eddie was probably already at the south pasture, trying to read what he hadn't learned to read yet. And Sam was somewhere doing Sam things, with the seriousness that made her think Sam would be something remarkable in 10 years. And Gus was wherever Gus was, which was always exactly where he needed to be. And she was standing on land that had water in it, and a man beside her who had turned his hand over and waited without asking. And she was not on the road, and she was not in a kitchen that wasn't hers, and she was not moving toward a next town with her bag on her lap, and her face turned away from whatever she'd had to leave. She was here. She reached up and put her hand against his face, just her palm against his jaw, the simplest possible gesture, the one that said more than any of the 12 pages she'd ever written. He put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They stood on his father's land with the water running east and the summer burning around them and everything that had almost been taken still firmly in place. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of more that a person who has had everything taken knows how to recognize when it finally arrives. By October, the Ridgeline Ranch had recovered 41 head of healthy cattle and had 2 new hands recommended by Doc Hennessy, who turned out to have opinions about everything and was generous with all of them. By October, the South Pasture Secondary Channel had opened up exactly where Clara had said it would, and Eddie had found it himself on a Tuesday morning, running to the kitchen to tell her with such unguarded excitement that even Gus smiled about it later when he thought no one was watching. By October, Holt had been located in a town 3 territories east, and federal charges had been formally filed, and Pruitt had given up every name he had in exchange for the reduced consideration that Clara had told Rowan he would give, and Rowan had told Creed, and Creed had used as the lever it was. By October, a letter came from the Territorial Land Office confirming that the Ridgeline Ranch water rights had been formally documented and registered in Rowan Callister's name, including the North Ridge Channel and the South Pasture Secondary, which was now also confirmed as a natural pre-existing source and not a diversion, not a creation. Simply what had always been there, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and the specific willingness to look. Rowan read the letter at the table. He slid it across to Clara. She read it. She slid it back. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table, across the table, where they'd written 12 pages in the dark, and rewritten the letter to Amarillo, and spread the old map, and sat side by side in the lamp's low light, until something between them, that neither of them had named, had become the most solid thing on the property. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Ask." "The notice I put up said room and board and monthly wages, and no references required," he said. "I never told you what else I was offering." She waited. "I'm telling you now," he said. "Everything here, the land and the water, and what it can become, and everything I know how to build, and everything I'm still learning." He held her gaze without wavering. "And me, whatever that's worth." She looked at him. She thought about the community board in Drywater Creek, and the notice printed on cheap paper, and the line that had hooked her, "No references required," and how she'd pulled it down before anyone could stop her. And she thought about Doss's wagon, and the high country air, and the first time she'd looked at Rowan Callister and read him the way she read land. And she thought about 12 pages, and a lamp burning low, and a hand turned palm up across a kitchen table, and a piece of cloth kept carefully in a drawer for months, by a man who understood that some things need to be preserved until they're useful. She thought about her father's hands in dry earth, and the way he'd taught her that the land always tells the truth, and most people are just too busy to listen. She had listened. And this ranch, this man, this water running east through ground that had held it patient and underground for 30 years, until someone finally freed it. This was what the land had been saying the whole time. "Yes," she said. Simple and complete and final, the way true things are. Rowan Callister looked at her across the table in the kitchen his father built, and the water ran east through the channel she had found, and the cattle moved in the pasture where they belonged, and the land that had tried to be taken and had not been taken settled itself fully into what it had always been: alive, resilient, and held by people who refused to let it go. Clara Briggs had come with nothing. She stayed for everything, and everything, it turned out, had been exactly where she'd looked.